Clara Whitmore did not cry the night her husband told a room full of powerful men that she was nothing more than a family obligation. She stood at the edge of the ballroom with one gloved hand pressed flat against a cold marble column, and she let the fiddle music swallow his words whole. And she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and something inside her did not break. It simply closed, the way a door closes when the latch finally settles into the frame, not slammed, not thrown open, just a small and very final click. She had loved this man in silence for 3 years, 3 years of waiting to matter. That night, she stopped waiting. If you have ever given your whole heart to someone who looked through you like glass, stay with this story, because it will find every corner of what you know. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Virginia like a slow fire, heavy and relentless, and pressing down on everything with the full weight of a season that refused to apologize for itself. The fields around Ashford House shimmered under a white sky, and every family of consequence within 40 miles had dressed in their finest and driven their carriages toward the Harrington Assembly Hall, where the polished floors and tall windows made ordinary people feel, for one evening at least, like they amounted to something. Clara Ashford, born Clara Whitmore, a name she still carried inside her like a pressed flower between the pages of a book she was no longer permitted to read, stood near the east column of the ballroom and watched the room move without her. She was 24 years old. She had been Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had learned the particular art of being invisible inside a marriage, which is harder than being invisible in a crowd, because in a crowd no one is supposed to see you, but in a marriage someone is, and when they do not, the absence of that gaze becomes the loudest thing in any room you share. She wore a pale blue gown that evening, the color of early morning before the heat arrived. Her dark hair was pinned simply, without the elaborate curls the other women favored. She had no jewels except a small pearl at each ear, a gift from her mother long before the Whitmore name had become something people lowered their voices around. She stood straight. She always stood straight. It was the one thing her father had given her that 3 years of cold silence and county gossip had never managed to take. Across the room, her husband stood at the center of a circle of men. Nathaniel Ashford was 33, tall enough to command space without trying, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested both physical strength and an absolute refusal to be moved by anything outside his own judgment. His dark coat was pressed perfectly. His jaw was set in that familiar way, not hostile exactly, but closed, like a door that had been locked from the inside, so long the key had been forgotten. He was the most powerful man in the county, and he wore that power the way other men wore hats, naturally, without thinking about it, as though it had simply always been there. Clara watched him from across the ballroom and felt, as she often did, the particular ache of loving someone who looked through you like glass. She had not meant to move closer. She told herself later that she had simply been trying to find a cooler spot near the window, but her feet carried her along the far edge of the room, past the potted ferns and the chattering wives, past old Judge Calloway and his deaf brother-in-law, until she was close enough to the circle of men to catch the low current of their conversation rising above the fiddle music. She heard her husband's voice first. She always recognized it before any other sound in a room. That was the particular cruelty of loving someone. Your body learned them before your mind had time to protect itself. "Ashford," said one of the men, and she recognized the voice as belonging to Preston Mercer, a land speculator from Richmond who smelled of tobacco and self-satisfaction. "I have always wondered about the Whitmore girl. You married beneath the family name?" "No question. Was that entirely your own decision, or did your father arrange it before he died?" There was a brief pause. Clara stopped walking. "A family obligation," Nathaniel said, His voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man answering a question he found mildly boring. Nothing more. The Whitmore situation was difficult. The marriage was the practical solution. Laughter moved through the circle, not cruel laughter, which almost would have been easier to bear, but the comfortable laughter of men who found nothing remarkable in what had just been said, because in their world, women were frequently described in exactly those terms. And that was simply the order of things. Clara stood with her hand pressed flat against the marble column. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The music continued, bright and lively and indifferent, something meant to lift the spirits and move the feet. Around her, couples stepped and turned and laughed. Mrs. Harrington was admiring her daughter's new sash. 3 young men near the punch bowl were arguing about horse breeding, and Clara Whitmore, Clara Ashford, stood still at the edge of all of it and felt the full weight of 3 years settle onto her shoulders at once. A family obligation, nothing more. She had known in some quiet and practical corner of herself that their marriage had not been a love match. She was not a foolish woman. She had understood from the beginning that Nathaniel Ashford had not chosen her the way a man chooses something he desires. He had chosen her the way a man signs a document deliberately without sentiment because the circumstances required it. She had told herself that was enough. That respect and security and the protection of his name were sufficient, that she could live in the space beside a man without ever truly being seen by him, and that over time perhaps the space might grow smaller. She had been wrong. She understood that now, standing in the middle of a ballroom in her pale blue gown, with the marble column cold against her palm, and the fiddle music, bright and indifferent, above her head. She turned and walked to the terrace. The night air was warm but thinner than the air inside, and it hit her face like the first honest thing she had felt all evening. She gripped the stone railing with both hands and looked out over the dark garden, where fireflies moved in slow drifts, and the distant fields were black and heavy under a half-moon. Behind her, the music and voices continued, sealed behind the tall glass doors, as though nothing had occurred. Nothing had occurred. That was the precise nature of the wound. She had not been struck. She had not been publicly shamed. Her husband had not even looked at her while he said it. A family obligation, nothing more, spoken the way a man mentions the weather, or the state of the roads, or any other arrangement that exists in the background of life without requiring particular feeling. When the glass doors opened behind her, she did not turn around. Clara, said Nathaniel's voice. Careful, never soft. He had never been soft, but careful in the way a man sounds when he is checking on property he wants to ensure is undamaged. The evening is nearly over. We should make our farewells. Of course, she said. She turned from the railing. She smoothed the front of her gown. She looked at her husband, standing in the doorway with the light from the ballroom outlining his shoulders, his expression unreadable in the way she had spent 3 years trying to read. "Are you well?" he asked, because the social script required it. "I am perfectly well," she said, because the social script required that too. She walked past him through the glass doors and spent the next 40 minutes saying polite farewells to people who had always treated her as a footnote to her husband's importance. And she did it with her back straight and her voice steady, and her face arranged in an expression of such composed pleasantness that not a single person in that room would have guessed that something had just quietly ended inside her. The carriage ride back to Ashford House took nearly an hour on the summer roads, and Nathaniel sat across from her in the dark and offered her exactly what he always offered, polite silence. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He did not shout. He did not demean her in front of the servants. He paid her bills and maintained her wardrobe and kept the house warm in winter and cool in summer, and never once failed to provide for her material comfort. These were the things he gave because they were the things a man of his position was expected to give, and Nathaniel Ashford did not fail to meet expectations. What he did not give what he had never given, not once in 3 years, was the simple act of looking at her like she mattered. The carriage rolled on through the dark Virginia night, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at nothing, and Nathaniel looked out the window at the passing road, and the silence between them was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Finally, because she was tired and because the evening had stripped away whatever remained of her restraint, she said, "Nathaniel." He turned from the window. At the assembly tonight, she kept her voice level, quiet. She was not accusing. She was simply, at last, speaking. "Preston Mercer asked you about our marriage." A pause. "He asks about a great many things that are none of his concern. You called it a family obligation," Clara said. "Nothing more." Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment in the darkness. "It is an accurate description of the arrangement." "Yes," Clara said, "I know." She turned back to the window. She went upstairs alone that night and sat at the edge of her bed in the dark, still in her pale blue gown, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees, and she breathed slowly, and she looked at the wall. She had loved this man since she was 19 years old. She had loved him when her family's name began to fall apart, when her father's debts came due, and the county started whispering, when she had nothing left to offer except herself. She had loved him quietly, without demand, without complaint, in the particular way of a woman who has been taught that love given humbly is the only kind a woman of her circumstances is permitted to offer. He had married her. He had given her protection and position and his name. He had never once looked at her like she was worth looking at. Clara sat in the dark for a long time. Then something happened that had not happened before. She stopped waiting. Not in the visible, declarative way of a woman making a dramatic decision. There was no moment of sudden revelation, no tears, no resolve spoken aloud to the empty room. It was quieter than that. It was the way a door closes when the latch finally settles. Not slammed, simply resting into the frame with a small and final click. She had been waiting for 3 years, waiting for him to look at her, waiting for him to speak her name with something other than duty in his voice, waiting to feel inside her own house like a person who deserved to be there. She was done, and in being done, something unexpected happened. She became, for the first time since her wedding day, entirely free. The next morning, before anyone else in the house was awake, Clara changed into her simplest dress, sturdy cotton, not lawn, not silk, and pulled her hair back without ceremony and walked out the back of Ashford House, while the dew was still on the grass and the summer sun was just beginning to press its first real heat against the sky. She walked to the tenant plots. The Ashford land ran for several hundred acres, and on the far eastern section a row of tenant families worked fields and cottages that were by every measure of the law maintained at Nathaniel's pleasure. Clara had ridden past them many times in the carriage. She had never stopped. That morning, she stopped. The first family she encountered was the Coopers, husband and wife, 4 children, a leaking roof that had already rotted 2 of the interior support beams. Gideon Cooper was standing outside looking at the roof with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that had no good solution and no good timing. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, with the particular careful surprise of a man who has never had the landlord's wife appear at his door before breakfast. "How long has this roof been like this?" Clara asked. He told her. She listened. Then she listened to what was underneath his answer, which was that he had reported it twice through the estate manager, Thomas, and had received in return 2 polite acknowledgements and no repairs. She thanked him. She walked to the next cottage and the next, and by the time the sun had fully risen she had spoken to 7 families and had written 3 pages of notes in the small journal she had carried in her dress pocket, which was the kind of practical habit that 3 years of invisible management of a household had made entirely second nature. What she discovered, walking the eastern plots in those early mornings, was that she had opinions. Strong ones. About the way the drainage ditches had been allowed to silt up on the northern edge of the Jennings plot. about the fact that the well serving 3 of the central cottages had a lining problem that anyone who had spent 30 minutes looking at it could identify, about the particular inefficiency of the way the harvest rotation had been organized, which was costing the tenant families roughly 1/3 of what they should have been earning from their labor. She had not known she had these opinions until she was standing in the actual places that required them, which told her something important about what happens to a person's mind when you keep them in ballrooms and breakfast tables and polite social functions for 3 years without ever asking them to think about anything that genuinely matters. Her mind, it turned out, was excellent, sharp and practical, and unimpressed by things that were not working simply because they had always been done that way. She had inherited it from her father, who, despite his financial failures, had been a man of genuine intelligence, and she had spent 3 years keeping it quiet because nobody in Ashford House had ever indicated they wanted to hear what it produced. The tenant families did not care whose wife she was. They cared whether the roof leaked, and whether the well was safe, and whether the physician was coming, and whether anyone with the authority to make changes was actually listening. Clara listened, and then she acted. She did not ask Nathaniel's permission. She did not ask Thomas's permission. She arranged a meeting with the local carpenter herself, using a portion of the household account she was legally entitled to manage, and she had the Cooper's roof repaired within a week. She arranged a second meeting with Dr. Samuel Reed, a young physician who had recently established himself in the county, and who had, in the 2 brief encounters Clara had had with him at social functions, shown the radical and somewhat unusual quality of speaking to her as though she were a full person rather than an ornament. Dr. Reed came out to the eastern plots with her and examined 3 families who had been managing symptoms of a recurring fever without medical attention. He caught what he believed was early evidence of the same infection in the Aldridge family, isolated it, treated it, and prevented what would almost certainly have become an outbreak affecting every tenant family on the estate before autumn. Clara organized the visits. Clara kept the records. Clara wrote the letters, and nobody, not Nathaniel, not Thomas, not Margaret Ashford, who missed nothing that happened in her son's house, said a single word to her about any of it for 6 full weeks, which told her everything she needed to know about exactly how invisible she had been permitted to become. Margaret Ashford was 61 years old, a woman built from Virginia granite and old money contempt, and she had made her opinion of the Whitmore marriage known from the moment Nathaniel had announced it. She had never shouted. The Ashford family did not shout, but she had never once allowed Clara to forget that she had arrived at this table with nothing and had therefore earned nothing. The morning after the assembly, Margaret appeared at the breakfast table and said without looking up, "I heard you were on the terrace alone for quite some time last night, Clara." The Mercer women were talking. "The evening was warm," Clara said. "A woman who leaves her husband's side at an assembly invites commentary," Margaret replied. "Your mother was never known for her social judgment. I suppose these things are learned at home." The table was quiet. Clara kept her hands still around her coffee cup. She had heard variations of this speech many times, the references to her mother, the references to her father's debts, the delicate persistent implication that Clara's very presence in this house was a kind of charitable concession that should produce continuous gratitude rather than independent opinion. She had always absorbed it in silence. From across the table, Nathaniel said, "That is enough, Mother." His voice was not loud. It rarely was. Clara looked at him with something like hope. But Nathaniel had already returned to his food, and she understood with a quiet and precise clarity that he had not defended her. He had defended the Ashford name. She was Mrs. Ashford. That was the extent of it. She set down her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said, "because courtesy required it." "It is nothing," he said, because that was precisely what it was. If you are watching this and you have ever worked hard in a place that refused to see you, you already know what happened next inside Clara. Something that had been soft became steady. Something that had been waiting became purposeful. She was not performing transformation for anyone. She was simply, for the first time in 3 years, living entirely for herself. Subscribe if you want to see what that kind of quiet strength looks like when it finally has room to breathe. It was at the county fair that Silas Harrow appeared. He walked through the crowd the way a man walks when he wants people to know he owns whatever room he is in, broad through the shoulders, with the particular physical confidence that comes from decades of being the largest creditor in any room. He was 53, with a magistrate's authority and a creditor's patience, and he had used both for 30 years to accumulate the kind of power that does not appear in any single document, but runs through a county like groundwater. Invisible everywhere and impossible to get out of once it gets into your foundation. He had wanted to marry Clara when she was 19, and her father's name was already fraying. He had presented himself to her father as the practical solution. Clara had refused him. Her father, weakened and afraid, had not been able to make her agree. Silas had left that conversation with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to the word no and had simply filed it away for later. Nathaniel had married her 4 months after that. Silas had never forgotten any part of it. He stopped in front of Clara at the fair with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "I heard you have been spending your time with the tenant farmers," he said, "bringing them food, organizing their medicine. That is very charitable." He said the word the way a man says a thing he means to be insulting without quite committing to the insult. "Given your family's situation, I suppose you have a natural sympathy for people who owe more than they can pay." The old Clara, the one who had spent 3 years trying to be invisible, might have taken a step backward. She did not step back. She stood exactly where she was, and she looked at him with the same steady eyes she had been turning on everyone who had underestimated the kind of woman she had become over the past months. "Mr. Harrow," she said, with the precise courtesy of a woman who has decided that politeness and yielding are not the same thing. "Good morning, is it?" He smiled wider. "Your father's land is still under lien. I often wonder what your husband's family thinks about that, having that attached to the Ashford name." "I am sure you do wonder," Clara said. "You have always been very interested in my family's business." A murmur moved through the people around them. Silas had expected her to flinch. He had expected the familiar quick drop of her gaze, the instinctive apology, the retreat that women like Clara were supposed to make in the face of public pressure from men like him. He had been reading that script so confidently that her failure to follow it had genuinely surprised him. He leaned forward slightly. "I recall a conversation with your father 8 years ago. That is enough." Nathaniel stepped forward, and he moved the way he moved when he had made a decision and was not interested in discussion, with a completeness of intention that shifted the air around him and made the people nearby take an involuntary half-step back, simply from the change in atmospheric pressure. He placed himself between Clara and Silas Harrow and looked at the older man with an expression that was not heated, not theatrical, not any of the visible forms of anger that can be argued with or performed around. It was colder than that. It was the expression of a man who has done the accounting and is now simply stating the result. "You will address my wife as Mrs. Ashford," Nathaniel said. "You will confine that address to civil topics, and you will not reference her family's past, in public or private, again." Silas looked at him with the practiced ease of a man who has stood in front of many people's anger. "Nathaniel, no offense intended. I know every financial arrangement you have made in this county for the past 15 years, Nathaniel said, still in that same level, uninflected voice. "I know about the Caldwell property. I know about the lien you placed on the Morrison estate 3 months after old Morrison died, and before his widow had legal counsel. I know about the arrangement you made with Judge Peters that was not strictly within the bounds of his judicial authority." He paused. "I would prefer to keep that knowledge where it currently resides. Whether it stays there depends entirely on how this conversation ends." The silence that followed had the quality of a room after a door has been slammed. Silas Harrow looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. "Always a pleasure, Nathaniel," he said. He walked away. Clara stood very still. She turned to look at her husband. He was still facing the direction Silas had gone, his jaw set, his shoulders held with that absolute controlled stillness. Then he turned to her, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not pride, not satisfaction, not any of the performative emotions a man deploys when he wants to be seen doing something significant. Just worry, plain and unguarded, there for 1 second before he contained it. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something further, and was running a calculation about whether he had the right to say it or how to say it, or whether saying it would require admitting something he was not ready to admit in the middle of a county fair with 40 people, pretending not to watch. And then he walked away toward the edge of the fair, towards space and air, and left Clara standing with the echo of his worry in her ears, feeling for the first time in a very long time that her husband had seen her with something that was not duty in his eyes. What neither of them spoke about in those early days, and what Clara only began to understand slowly through observation rather than confession, was what the past 3 years had looked like from inside Nathaniel's silence. She had always assumed his coldness was indifference. She was beginning to see that it was something else entirely. It was the armor of a man who had learned, very early and very thoroughly, that the safest version of himself was the one that needed nothing from anyone. His father had been that kind of man. Edmund Ashford had run one of the largest estates in the county with the emotional temperature of a bank ledger. He had not been cruel. He had simply been entirely absent from every room he occupied in any way that mattered to the people in it. And Nathaniel had watched him and learned what it looked like to be powerful, and had confused that with what it looked like to be whole. So, when Nathaniel had arrived at the Whitmore estate 3 years ago and looked at Clara across the small sitting room where her father had introduced them, when he had felt something move through him that he did not have a name for and did not know what to do with, he had done the only thing he knew how to do with anything that threatened his composure. He had contained it. He had built a wall around it and called the wall practicality, and told himself that the arrangement was sensible and the girl was suitable, and that whatever he felt on that afternoon was simply the appropriate satisfaction of a man who has resolved a complicated problem cleanly. He had been lying to himself so consistently for 3 years that he had almost stopped knowing he was doing it. Almost, the fair had cracked it open. Watching her stand in front of Silas Harrow without flinching, watching her look at that man with steady eyes and answer him with precision and zero fear, he had felt something move through his chest that was not satisfaction, and was not pride, and was not any of the emotions a man is supposed to feel about a business arrangement he has made efficiently. He had felt it again watching her dance with Samuel Reed, that particular cold current of jealousy that arrives not as vanity but as recognition, the recognition of a man who suddenly sees with perfect clarity that someone else knows how to be present with the person he loves and he does not, and that the difference between them in that particular quality is not small and is entirely his own fault. He had walked away from the fair that day because he needed air, and because standing still in that crowd, with that feeling in his chest and no language for it, was more than he could manage without doing something that would have required him to admit, out loud, to himself and to Clara and to 40 people, pretending not to watch, that the 3 coldest and most careful years of his life had been the wrong way to spend them. 3 days later, she found the letter. She was not looking for it. She had gone into Nathaniel's library to return an agricultural text she had borrowed, to understand the crop rotations on the eastern plots, and when she slid the book back onto the shelf, it dislodged something from the space behind it. A folded paper slid out and fell to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, she saw it was not a loose page from a text, but a sealed letter folded around something smaller, and her own name was written on the outside, not Mrs. Ashford, but Clara, in her father's handwriting. She stood in Nathaniel's library for a long moment, holding the paper with the afternoon heat, pressing in through the windows and the house completely quiet around her. She opened it. Her father had written it 2 months before the wedding. The handwriting was unsteady. She could see in the way the letters moved how much effort it had cost him, how tired he had been, how much the weight of what he was writing was pressing on the hand holding the pen. She read it, standing up, without moving, the way you read something, when you are not sure your legs will hold you when you reach the end. Her father had not arranged her marriage to Nathaniel Ashford. Nathaniel had arranged it himself. Silas Harrow had moved against the Whitmore estate the winter of 1812, quietly, legally, through a series of debt consolidations and land liens that her father had not fully understood until it was too late, by which point Silas had effectively positioned himself to foreclose on everything and offer her father a single way out, the marriage of his daughter, not to Silas himself. He had long since moved past that particular ambition, but to a business associate of his, a young man from Richmond, whose character her father had looked into and had not liked what he found. Nathaniel had learned of it through his banking connections. He had gone to her father before the deadline. He had proposed the alternative. He would assume the Whitmore debts in full, arrange a settlement that kept the land lien from reaching foreclosure, and marry Clara not as a transaction but as a protection, a removal of the immediate threat. A way out of the corner Silas had constructed. Her father had asked him why. Nathaniel had said he had his reasons, and he preferred not to discuss them. Her father had written in the letter that he had believed the young man meant it honestly, that there was something in how he had spoken of Clara. Quickly, and then pulling back from it as though he had said more than he intended, that made her father think Nathaniel Ashford was not a man doing a business favor, but a man doing the only thing he could think of to protect someone he had already decided mattered to him. Her father had written, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know that you were chosen, Clara. Not as a remedy, not as an obligation." The obligation came later, when Nathaniel could not find the courage to be honest about the first thing. But the first thing was a choice, freely made. I want you to know that before anything else happens that might make you forget it. Clara stood in the library for a long time. She read the letter twice. She read it a third time more slowly, stopping at the line about Nathaniel pulling back from something he had nearly said, and she thought about the past 3 years. She thought about the ballroom and the carriage and the breakfast table and all the 1,000 daily silences that she had read as indifference, and that now, with the letter in her hands and her father's unsteady handwriting in front of her, were beginning to rearrange themselves into something that looked less like coldness and more like fear. She was still sitting in the library chair an hour later when Nathaniel came in. He saw the letter. He stopped in the doorway. The silence in that room was different from every other silence they had shared in 3 years. This one had something alive in it, something that had been sealed in a wall for a very long time and had just been let out into the air. "You knew," she said, "about Silas, what he planned for me." Nathaniel said nothing. "You went to my father," said, "before I ever knew any of it was happening. Why didn't you tell me?" The question was not loud. It was not accusatory in the sharp public way of someone who wants to wound. It was the plain and direct question of a woman who has been given, at last, an explanation she was never supposed to have, and who needs simply, completely, without performance, to understand. Nathaniel came into the room. He did not sit. He stood, with his hands at his sides, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not in 3 years, not in any version of him she had witnessed. Because it was the expression of a man who has run out of the particular protection that distance provides, and is standing in the open for the first time without knowing what to do with it. "I did not tell you," he said, "because I did not want you to feel indebted." "Indebted," Clara repeated. "I knew if you knew the full circumstances, you would feel as though you owed me something, as though the marriage was a debt to be repaid instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of what?" Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Instead of what it was meant to be," he said. "What was it meant to be?" she asked. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see the war in him. The man who had been taught his entire life that what he felt was a liability, that opening was weakness, that the safest version of himself was the controlled one, the unreadable one, the one who managed everything and revealed nothing. "It was meant to be," he said finally. "A beginning." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at her husband, this man she had loved for 3 years, and watched from across every room they shared, and she felt the complicated truth of what it means to learn that someone has loved you badly in the precise way of a person who did not know how to love well. It does not make the 3 years shorter. It does not make the loneliness smaller. But it does, she found, make the person standing in front of you more human than you had perhaps allowed them to be. "Why did you keep the letter?" she asked. "I found it among your father's things after he died," he said. "I kept it because it was yours. I did not give it to you because I was afraid of what it would change." "And has it?" she said. "Has it changed something?" He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said quietly, "I think it has changed everything." Then he said, "I am sorry, Clara," and those 3 words, simple and unadorned, and spoken without any of the careful management that had characterized every sentence he had given her for 3 years, landed in the room like the first honest thing he had ever said to her. She did not forgive him that afternoon. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a door you could open all at once after it had been nailed shut for 3 years. But she told him what she needed. She needed honesty, not politeness, not management, not the careful version of things he gave people when he was deciding how much of himself was safe to show. She needed the actual thing, all of it. She did not care if it was uncomfortable. She did not care if it made him look like something other than the most controlled man in the county. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "That is all," she said. "That is everything," he said. And we both know it. What followed was not a dramatic overnight transformation. It was slower than that and more real. Nathaniel began coming to the eastern plots, not to oversee Clara's work, but to understand it. And there was a difference between those 2 things that she noticed immediately. He resolved a 12-year boundary dispute in the Marsh family's favor. He introduced himself to Gideon Cooper by name and asked about the rebuilt roof with the slightly awkward directness of a man who has recently discovered that knowing the people on his land requires actually speaking to them. He told Samuel Reed, who had become a quiet and reliable presence in Clara's days, that he owed him an apology for the way he had treated him at the fair, and he said it plainly, without ornament, with the slightly painful directness of a man who has recently learned that plain speaking is the only kind that does the job he needs it to do. Clara did not soften toward him because he was trying. She softened toward him because she could see that the trying was costing him something, and that a man who allows something to cost him is a different man than the one who lets nothing in. They rode out together one afternoon to survey the creek boundary on the north side, and it was the first time in 3 years that they had gone somewhere together that was not a social obligation with an audience. There was no one watching. There was no performance required. There was only the 2 of them, and the land and the slow, tentative work of 2 people trying to find out whether they still knew how to be in each other's company when it was not being managed. They talked about the creek. They talked about the Northfield drainage problem. They rode in silence for a while after that, the comfortable kind, or close to it. Not the heavy silence of avoidance, but the quieter silence of two people who have said enough for now and are allowing it to settle. Then he said, without looking at her, "I was jealous of Samuel Reed." Clara looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. It was an ugly feeling, and not a fair one. He said, "I am not claiming it was fair. I am telling you it was real." He looked at her. All of it was real. Everything I did not say, it was real. I just had no idea how to say any of it, without losing the only version of myself I knew how to be. Clara looked at her husband riding beside her in the summer heat, this man who had been taught by a cold father that feeling was failure, who had loved her in the worst possible way, silently, protectively, from behind a wall he did not know how to take down. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her. "That does not mean it was enough," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I am not asking for enough. I am asking for the chance to find out what enough might look like." Clara held the reins steady and looked at the road ahead and felt the complicated truth of caring about someone who has hurt you, which is that caring does not stop simply because the hurt is real. "One condition," she said. "Honesty," she said. "Not politeness, not management, not the careful version of things. The actual thing. All of it." He met her eyes. He said. 3 days later, Margaret Ashford crossed a line she could not uncross. It happened at supper. She set down her fork and looked at Clara and said, with the precise measured delivery of a woman who had been composing this sentence for some time, "I heard from Patricia Mercer that you have been seen riding alone with Dr. Reed on the Eastern Road on more than one occasion." The table went quiet. Clara set down her own fork. "I have ridden out to the tenant families on multiple occasions, yes. Samuel has come with me twice to follow up on medical cases." "Samuel," Margaret repeated, catching the name. "Dr. Reed," Clara said evenly. "I know what it looks like," Margaret said, "and so does the county, Margaret." Nathaniel's voice was quiet, the way it had been quiet at the breakfast table months ago when he had told her that was enough. Except this time it had something different in it, not just the defense of a name, something more personal than that. "The failure here is mine." "Not hers," Nathaniel said, and the words came out with a directness that silenced the room completely, because it was a man publicly accounting for himself, and no one at that table had expected it. "I was not paying sufficient attention to my own estate or my own wife, and I will not allow you to redistribute that failure onto her." Margaret stared at her son. Nathaniel looked at his mother with a steadiness that was entirely different from the steadiness he usually deployed at this table. Not management, not containment, but the simple, clear look of a man who has decided where he stands and is no longer interested in debating it. "Clara is the mistress of this house," he said, "not because of my name, because of who she is. And I should have said that clearly and without qualification a long time ago." He looked at Clara. "I am saying it now." Clara looked at her husband and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at the moments that mattered. She was a woman who went very still and felt things all the way through, which was harder and more honest. She said, "Thank you, Nathaniel. Not the polite thank you of 3 years ago, spoken because courtesy required it. The real one." Margaret left the table early that evening. Nobody commented, but something shifted in the house after that, something atmospheric and hard to name, the way the air changes after a long overdue storm. Margaret did not disappear from their lives. She was not the kind of woman who disappeared, but she adjusted, subtly, the way a woman of her generation and pride adjusts when she has been told clearly that the territory has changed, without being told explicitly that she has lost ground. She stopped making references to the Whitmore name at the breakfast table. She stopped tilting words to catch light. She began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to direct small domestic questions to Clara, with the slightly careful neutrality of a woman who is relearning which door in a house belongs to whom. It was not warmth. Clara did not expect warmth, and she did not need it. It was simply acknowledgement, the acknowledgement that Clara was not a footnote, not a charity case, not a problem that had been generously absorbed. She was the mistress of this house, not because of a man's name, but because of who she was. And Nathaniel had said so out loud, at the supper table, in front of Thomas and the serving staff and the whole quiet architecture of Ashford House, without hedging, without management, without anything except the plain and somewhat uncharacteristic honesty of a man who has finally decided to stop protecting himself at someone else's expense. Clara found in the weeks that followed that she thought about her father often. She thought about his letter and his unsteady handwriting, and the line about Nathaniel pulling back from something he had nearly said. She thought about what it must have cost her father to write that letter, sick and tired and carrying the weight of what his failures had set in motion, trying to give his daughter the one thing he had left to give her, which was the truth. She thought about the fact that he had trusted Nathaniel with the letter, had left it in Nathaniel's keeping, had believed that the young man who had come to his door and proposed the alternative was the kind of man who would eventually find the courage to give Clara what she deserved to know. Her father had been right about Nathaniel. He had simply overestimated how quickly a man who has learned to lock everything away can learn to open the door again. Clara could not be angry at her father for that optimism. She had loved him too much for too long, and she thought, sitting at her writing desk one morning in late August while the house was quiet around her and the summer was finally, faintly, beginning to turn, that what her father had wanted for her was not a perfect man. It was an honest one, and she believed, finally in the presence of that, or at least in the presence of a man who was working very hard, at genuine cost to the version of himself he had always hidden behind, to become one. Margaret left the table early that evening. Nobody commented on her absence, but Thomas quietly refilled his wine glass, and that told Clara everything she needed to know about how the wind was blowing at Ashford House. If you have stayed with this story this long, you already understand what is happening. You have seen it before, in your own life, or in the life of someone you love. The long, slow work of two people learning to be honest with each other after years of living behind the careful architecture of what they thought they were supposed to be. This is the part most stories skip. Most stories give you the apology and then jump to the ending. But the real story, the one worth watching, is everything between the apology and the ending. And Clara knew that better than anyone. Like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the slow work is worth it, and keep watching. The second county assembly of that summer was held on a Friday in August, and the Harrington Hall was cooler than it had been in July, the air just beginning to carry the first suggestion of the season turning. Clara dressed in green this time, a deeper color than the pale blue of a year ago, and she did not need the marble column when she arrived. She stood in the middle of the room and felt it differently than she had ever felt it before. Not as a place she was merely tolerated, but as a place she had, over the course of one summer, without permission or announcement, simply become. People spoke to her with the particular quality of speaking that means you have become someone who is known for something. Mrs. Cooper asked about the drainage work on the North Plot. Dr. Reed's assistant asked whether she had seen the new medical supply catalogue from Richmond. Two women she had never spoken to at a social function before came to her with questions about organizing a winter supply effort for the Eastern families, questions that presumed she was the person to ask, because she was. She answered them all. She was present in a way she had not been present in this room a year ago, not performing composure, just living in herself without apology. Nathaniel watched her from across the room. He watched her the way he had always watched her. She understood that now, the way he had always watched her and had always looked away before she could see it. The way a man watches something that frightens him because of how much it means to him. He watched her talk to the Cooper woman and answer the medical question, and handle the two new women with that particular quality she had, steady and warm and direct all at once, and he felt, moving through his chest, the specific and irreversible weight of a man who understands that he nearly lost something extraordinary by refusing to admit he had it. When the fiddle moved into the first reel, he crossed the room. "Clara," he said, simply, and held out his hand. She looked at him. "Is this?" she began. "Would you dance with me?" he said, not performing it, not managing it, just asking, plainly, with the slightly uncertain quality of a man who is doing something he is not certain of, because he has decided that uncertainty is not a reason to stop. She thought about the marble column. She thought about the pale blue gown, and the carriage ride, and the breakfast table, and her father's letter, and the summer mornings on the eastern plots, and every conversation in which she had slowly, honestly, at the cost of the easier versions of herself, become the woman she was standing as right now. "Yes," she said. He took her hand, not her arm, not the formal social architecture of a man escorting a wife, and he walked with her to the center of the floor, and the fiddle moved into the reel, and they danced. It was not a perfect dance. Nathaniel was not, it turned out, a natural dancer, and Clara found this unexpectedly and completely delightful, because it meant he was doing something he was not certain of in public, in the middle of the county assembly, because she had said yes. He held her hand, and he moved with her, and he did not look at the room. He looked at her, only at her, and the room, the county, the careful Virginia social architecture, the women who had always treated her as a footnote, and the men who had taken their cue from her husband's posture. The room watched Nathaniel Ashford dance with his wife in the middle of the Harrington assembly floor, and what they saw was not a man managing a social obligation. What they saw was a man who could not look away from the woman he was with. When the reel ended, Nathaniel did not release her hand. He stood in the middle of the floor and said, not quietly but clearly, in the tone he used when he intended to be heard, "I want to say something." The music paused. The room shifted into that particular listening quality that comes over a crowd when a man of consequence speaks without the preface of an announcement. Nathaniel looked at the room. Then he looked at Clara. "Most of you know that my wife has spent this past summer working on the Eastern tenant plots," he said. She organized the medical consultations with Dr. Reed that caught the fever outbreak in the Aldridge family before it spread to the wider community. She directed the well repair that prevented a water shortage that would have affected 6 families through the winter. She repaired relationships between the estate and the tenant families that I had let fall into neglect. He paused. She did all of it without being asked, without recognition, without her husband showing a fraction of the attention and respect it deserved. The room was very quiet. Clara stood beside him with her hand in his and looked at his profile and felt the particular ache that comes not from being hurt, but from watching someone be more honest than they have ever been, at real cost, in front of everyone who matters to them. "I called this woman an obligation once," Nathaniel said, "in this room, a year ago." From that corner he did not look at the corner. He looked at Clara. "I was wrong. I was wrong about what she is to me, wrong about what I owed her, and wrong about the kind of man I had been choosing to be." He held her gaze. "She is the reason Ashford House is the place it is this year rather than the place it was last year. She is the most capable, most honest, most genuinely good person I have had the privilege of knowing, and I am asking her, in front of all of you, to believe that I understand the difference now between what I gave her and what she deserved, and that I intend to spend however long she allows me making that difference smaller every day." The room was completely still. Clara looked at her husband. She felt the year behind her, all of it. The marble column and the carriage silence, and the breakfast table, and the sitting room, and the letter, and the summer mornings, and the courthouse, and every conversation in which she had, slowly, honestly, at the cost of the easier versions of herself, become the woman she was standing as right now. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes," he said. He was still looking at her, only her. That was a very long speech, she said, for a man who did not used to say anything. Something happened in his expression that she had been waiting to see for 3 years. Open, unguarded, lit from inside, and he laughed, really laughed, in the middle of the Harrington Assembly floor in front of the entire county, with no management of it at all. "I had a good teacher," he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest, over the carefully pressed coat, over the contained, armored, finally opening heart of the most complicated man she had ever known. And she said, clearly and without any angle to it, "Take me home, Nathaniel." He covered her hand with his. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They left the assembly early. The county would have its opinions, as it always did, and those opinions would move through church pews and kitchen tables and front porches for weeks. Clara had stopped caring about that somewhere in July, and she found that not caring about it had not in fact made the world fall apart. It had simply made the world smaller and more real. In the carriage, they sat on the same side. She was not sure who had moved first. It did not seem important. The road back to Ashford House was the same road it had always been, through the same summer dark, under the same half-moon that had been there a year ago, when she had sat across from her husband in the silence of two people who had everything between them, and were not saying any of it. She sat beside him now, and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is not the end of something, but the real beginning of it. Not the declared beginning, not the announced one, but the quiet and honest beginning that happens when two people have done the hard work of becoming honest with each other and are finally ready to find out what comes next. Nathaniel's hand was over hers on the seat. They did not talk on the road home, but this silence was different from every silence that had come before it, because it was the silence of two people who know they will talk later, tomorrow, next week, for as long as they are given, who have all the time they need and no longer feel the need to rush toward it or fear being kept from it. Ashford House appeared at the end of the drive, lit from inside the way it always was when the staff kept the lamps burning until the family returned. It looked different than it used to, not the building. The building was the same, but something in how Clara received the sight of it had changed. It was not the house she had arrived at 3 years ago, feeling like a charity case given a key and told to be grateful. It was not the house she had spent 2 years trying to make herself visible inside. It was the house she had made her own, room by room, morning by morning, choice by choice. The east sitting room and the kitchen table and the library and the long walks to the creek before sunrise. She had not waited for Ashford House to accept her. She had simply, stubbornly, gracefully claimed it, one act of honest living at a time, and now the man who owned it, who had always, it turned out, wanted her to have it, was sitting beside her with his hand over hers, and the house at the end of the drive was lit warm against the August dark. They went inside together. The door closed behind them, and Clara Whitmore, who had once pressed her palm flat against a marble column and held herself together by will alone while the music played on without her, walked through her own front door with her husband's hand in hers. And she was home, and she knew it, and she did not need anything or anyone to tell her so. The woman who had been called an obligation became the woman who built a home, and that was the truest, most complete, most irreversible thing about her. Not what she had been given, not what she had endured, but what she had chosen, daily and without apology, to become. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a declaration or a dramatic exit or a public confrontation, though sometimes those things are part of it. It arrives, rather, in the quiet moments when a person who has been told by the world around them that they are not worth much decides, without fanfare, to disagree. Clara Whitmore had disagreed. She had disagreed in the only way that actually changes anything, not by arguing, not by demanding to be seen, but by becoming, so thoroughly and so honestly and so without permission, the kind of person that the world eventually cannot look away from. She had built something in herself across that summer that no amount of silence or coldness or public dismissals had been able to dismantle, because she had not built it for anyone else. She had built it for herself, and when Nathaniel Ashford finally turned and looked at her with eyes that were open for the first time in 3 years, what he saw was not a woman waiting to be chosen. He saw a woman who had already chosen herself, fully and completely and without apology, and who was now generously and entirely on her own terms, choosing to let him in. If this story found something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the ballroom? Was it the letter? Was it the dance? Was it the carriage ride home? Your comment matters more than you know, because every story that travels further means one more person who feels a little less alone in what they are carrying. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Stories about quiet strength. Stories about the long, slow work of becoming. Stories about the people who do not quit, and the love that in the end decides to be worthy of them. And drop your city below. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story has traveled, because I have a feeling it has a very long way still to go.